We felt good that Caleb Williams gets to go into the offseason with a game-winning drive at the end of the game. The Bears get to go into the offseason with a win over Green Bay. Does that matter going into his first offseason here in the NFL?
I mean, I think everything matters. I think, finishing on a high note, having some momentum, feeling good about yourself going into the off season, even with changes, is always great. I remember back in '07 when I was with the Cardinals and we were trying to turn things around, and we won 5 of our last 8, and then we won the last 2 going into the off season, and it would be the next season that we made the run to the Super Bowl. So I think, when you're building something, every little positive is something that you take with you. You kind of put it in your bag and you go, okay, these are steps towards, building towards what we want to be. Now, again, a lot of changes are going to happen and different things, but I think as a player, you hang on to anything that's pushing you in the right direction and where you see kind of a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel. And so, I think that's something that, the guys that are going to be there, guys like Caleb Williams, take with you and say, okay, we had moments and we finished on a good moment, and let's carry that into some momentum in the offseason.
In the first quarter, the Bears were terrible all year. They scored 27 points. Caleb had a quarterback rating of 78.8. In the fourth quarter, they were much, much better, and he had a quarterback rating of 95.3. What do you take away from that trend?
I guess I think the biggest thing sometimes when you get into, the fourth quarter, I think there can be a lot of elements to it. Obviously, the game sometimes can become simpler, when you're in more of a 2-minute mode, when you're playing in those moments and you're playing from behind, and defenses, the kind of looks they give you and things can be a little more generic. And you can be a little bit more in your wheelhouse because it's not all the stuff that you game plan necessarily. It's just, hey, we got these handful of plays that we run in these kind of modes. And so the comfort level there, I think can just be, something that you can kind of, look at in those kind of situations and go, well, maybe that's why. And I think there's often been times where I've even wondered why teams don't, take those. Cause like when we were in a 2-minute drill, we usually had 10 plays or so that we would run consistently. And, those were kind of our base plays and our go-to plays. And I've often wondered why teams, don't do those kind of base plays more often throughout a game, because you've run them all year long. They're things that have been based from the first day of training camp. And you save them for those moments. But if they're your best plays and your most comfortable plays, why do you not build them in more often? But, we all have this mindset that, hey, I'm watching the film of the new opponent and, here, let's add some new wrinkles to things that we haven't done before because we've seen other teams do it, or we think it'll attack this defense and all of that stuff. But then oftentimes you see teams execute those 10 plays, 12 plays really, really well because they're comfortable with them. And so, I think there's probably a number of different factors that go into that. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of them. It just, everything becomes simplified in those moments. And when the game's simplified, you're seeing some things that, are better probably from Caleb Williams. You talk about the whole Bears offense, but from Caleb Williams that you may not see earlier in games.
Kurt, we've been listening to a couple of sound bites that have come out of the locker room, and the coaches have talked about over the last week and maybe 2 weeks or so, they've given us the hint that perhaps they're coaching Caleb a little bit harder now than what was happening under Shane Waldron or under Matt Eberflus earlier in the season. I don't want to assess blame, but I am curious because you've talked a little bit about, I love when you discuss the younger quarterbacks and them having to explain why to you when they make a decision. When you hear the idea of someone being coached harder at the quarterback position, where does your mind go and what might that mean?
Well, I mean, what it would mean to me is that you're holding them more accountable for, what you have to do as an NFL quarterback. That's the thing that's always interesting. You say coach them harder. Like, I almost feel that there's really only one way to coach. The only one way to coach these guys, and that's to coach them with what you believe and what you expect them to do and what you think they must do to play at the NFL level. And then you hold them to that. And you know, that doesn't mean you berate them at every mistake, but you have a standard and you hold them to that standard at all times. Like if I'm calling a play and this is the expectation of the play, I need you to do that. And if you're not doing that, I need to know why. I need to hold you accountable. If you made a mistake, if your eyes were in the wrong spot, if whatever, there's an accountability factor. And that to me is when you say coach hard. I mean, to me, coaching hard is coaching to perfection, knowing that you're never going to reach perfection, but you coach to perfection and you coach to expect your guy to do what's needed at that position. And even if you're a young guy, I know you're going to make more mistakes, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to take every play and go, this is what I expect from you on this play, mentally and physically. And I'm going to hold you to that standard because that's the only way to be great in this business is to be held to that standard, to play to that standard. And is that standard going to be high? Well, I know for me it would be high, but it's going to be high for whoever's playing the position and especially whoever's starting at that position. I think there is a level of play that you must expect from NFL quarterbacks. And, you know, I hear this all the time. Well, what if a guy can't do this? And what if a guy can't do that? And I'm just a believer that if you can't do that, then you're not a starter in the national. Like, I don't think my expectation would be to do something that you wouldn't expect, you know, the other 31 starters in the league to do. If you're doing that, then okay, now you're overcoaching or you're coaching somebody too hard. If you're asking them and expecting them to do something they can't do. But if you're seeing guys do it, if you've been around guys that have done it, if you know you're a guy that has done it, then of course your expectation is going to be that that's the level. That's where we coach them, and that's what we expect from that position, and we will coach through it, and we will teach through it. But that is the expectation, and that expectation doesn't change. I mean, Coach Tomlin has that saying he always says, the standard is a standard. Mm-hmm. And that to me is what coaching hard is that here's our standard. You must meet this standard, and we are going to push you until that standard becomes the standard for you and everybody on the football team. So that to me is what coaching hard means. It's just setting your standard and making sure everybody lives up to it.
This is the primary issue in the coaching and quarterback dynamic that we've lived through. It's been incredibly clear that the staff in place now has stepped it up as opposed to the staff before with Caleb. And we're wondering, is it a generational issue, or is this something that you saw on different teams, that sometimes because of the difficulty of the position or because of the stature of a particular quarterback or because of personalities, that sometimes some coaches would not coach a quarterback hard? How far back does that go?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of things, but, you know, and I think it falls on both sides. I mean, the first side from coaching is I do believe you have to understand who your player is, what they respond to, and what they do well. You know, some people, and, you know, I'll just use some examples of, you know, really great wide receivers that I was around in my career. I was surrounded by a whole bunch of them, and I had to learn how to lead them. You know, one guy, I could challenge him. You know, I could be up in a meeting room and I could challenge that guy. You know, like, why are you doing this in this situation where you really need to do that? And in challenging him in front of other people, that's what, you know, resonated with him. Like, hey, I'm never going to let that happen again. I don't want him to call me out in a meeting ever again. I could maybe call another great receiver out in a meeting, and he might not speak to me for a week. And he might just come and tell me, hey, don't call me out in a meeting. Just come to me and, you know, tell me what you need differently, and I'll do it, you know, as a pro. And, you know, so it's understanding what resonates with your guys to get them to play to that standard, to allow you to coach them hard. There's different ways to coach them to the standard. Doesn't always have to be universal across the board to everybody, but you still got to coach them to that standard. You just have to figure out what connects with the different players. And so I think that's the first thing as a coach. You got to understand that some guys don't respond as well to aggressive coaching as they would to, more of that loving coaching. But regardless of how you do it, I'm still expecting the same thing. Just because I'm, loving on this guy more than I'm aggressively coaching him, doesn't mean he gets some leniency in what I'm expecting from him. It's just a different way of doing it by knowing who they are. And then I think the other side is the player. The player has to want to be coached hard. The player has to want to have an accountability and to have to reach that standard and be pushed in every area to that standard. You got to want to be coached to be great and not think that you already have it or think that, hey, well, be a little more light on me and think that that's going to get there. So I know there's a part of that in different players and you could say it's generational. I don't know if it's generational or just specific players. But you have to want it. I mean, as a player, you have to want to be coached and pushed and somebody to teach you. I've always said we don't learn anything until someone teaches us that. So it's always interesting to me when, you want to talk to different quarterbacks or talk to different coaches and they don't really want to reach out and have those conversations. And it's just weird because it's like, well, I already got it. I already know it all. And it's like, well, you didn't know it until somebody taught you. So why not continually challenge what you believe, what your perspective is, what you know, to see if there's somebody else out there that can teach you something else, that can, show you something that can take you to another level. And, and I think that's important for all positions. I think it's really important for the quarterback position is always not looking to defend yourself, which is a natural thing to do. I've said this many times. You go into a room with, all your teammates and you're watching the game from the day before. And the natural human thing to do is to, kind of watch the tape and then try to defend what you did on a play so it doesn't look as bad or, well, this is what I saw. Instead of just going, you know what? I know exactly what happened on that play and I was wrong and I made a mistake. And you stand up and you say, that was on me. This is what I saw, or this is what I did. And so you have to look for those things, but it's not always human nature. Human nature oftentimes is to try to deflect and pretend like we know it or pretend like we got it or it wasn't on us. Where to me, greatness is about point it out, show me where I need to get better. Show me where I made a mistake. Show me how I can correct that mistake so I don't let it happen again. And so I think that's the player's responsibility. The other is the coach's responsibility. And it's somehow figuring out how to meet in the middle. And then back to what we talked about at the beginning, setting the standard. This is our standard. Coach me to that standard, right? Make me live up to that standard, and figure out ways to help me get to that standard if you're the coach. And that's, to me, how you get the best out of everybody.
I meant to ask you this a couple of weeks ago, and it's kind of a two-part question. You just strike me as someone who's always prepared, Kurt. So I wanted to ask you, do you have a doomsday folder in case someone wanted to interview you to be a head coach? And two, I would love to know, is there anyone of the names that you've heard or the style of coach that you've talked to or heard that you think would be a good fit for the Bears?
I do not have a folder. I am not looking, and my future is probably not in the coaching field in terms of full-time coach. Just too blessed to be in that situation. And as much as I love the game, and I've always said, I'd love to be a consultant. I'd love to help teams game plan or, connect with teams and be a part of what they do from a consulting standpoint. I'll probably never get into the head coaching aspect or even the coaching aspect unless I've got a son that wants to get into coaching, unless he maybe takes a spot one day and becomes a head coach and asks dad to come help him. Maybe that's one way. But outside of that, I don't see myself getting into that field, but I want to help as many people, players, coaches that I can in that process.
All right, so great. So help the Bears right now. Who should they hire? Well,
I mean, to me, I've always believed, and because I've been around, a lot of different coaches, coaches that, I've never really been, had a head coach that was necessarily a defensive guy, but I've had head coaches that are offensive guys and kind of been in different roles. And I'm just a firm believer that you hire a head coach that's a head coach. You hire a head coach that can lead men. You hire a head coach that can carry out a vision that they have for your organization. You hire the CEO as your head coach. And I think what we've seen so often throughout, the last decade or so is that a lot of teams will sacrifice the head coach, for the hot offense or defensive coordinator, because you feel like, well, there's no way we're going to get that guy unless we make him the head coach. But a lot of those guys aren't necessarily the CEO type. They're not the head coaching type. And so you're hiring them for their offense or defensive expertise, but they don't have the expertise to run an organization. And so I'm a believer that you go hire someone that can run your organization, someone that can lead men, someone that can, come the first day and say, this is my vision, have a plan for that vision, and stay consistent with that vision. So for instance, Ken Wisenhunt took over with the Cardinals when I was there. And he came in day one and said, this is what we're going to do. We are going to win. We are going to have success. And this is how we were going to do it. And the first day that he said that, maybe it's a little rah-rah. Okay, yeah, we can rally around that guy. But it was about the daily consistency of him sharing that message and following through on that message, and one step at a time and building this thing. And he came as an offense coordinator. So obviously, a big part of why he was coming was offense success that he had in Pittsburgh and all of that stuff. But ultimately, at the end of the day, he always had a hand in the offense. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that was passed on to Todd Haley and myself and us building the offense with his influence on it. But his job was to lead and become the head coach and share and take us to that vision and do all the things that he needed to do. And it was a reason why we had success. It's because I remember, his talk about the vision on day one, and he never wavered from that. And even though it was a tough situation and a tough organization that had never really won, he stood true to what he believed in and what he said day one, and watched, player after player, year after year, us start to buy in. And ultimately we got to where we wanted to be. And so that, to me, for all of these organizations that are looking for a head coach, I get it. We got a young quarterback. We want the offense to be really, really good. We got a bad defense. We want the defense to turn it around so we can be successful because our offense is pretty good. At the end of the day, I've seen guys that are great coordinators that are not great head coaches. And it never works when you don't have a great head coach, a great leader of men, a great visionary that can see that through and have a plan to get that done. So, I don't care who you are. I don't care how good your young quarterback is. Get a CEO, get a head coach, get a guy that leads men. And that, to me, is where you always start. And then you find the complementary pieces from there. And so obviously a name that's out there is a guy like Mike Vrabel. He's a head coach. He's a leader of men. He's a guy that will come in with a vision, and he will come in with a standard, and he will hold people to that standard. Now, I don't know if he's the right fit necessarily for Chicago, but I think he can be the right fit for any organization because of who he is. When I would sit down with him, I knew him as a player, but when I would sit down with him in production meetings and we would have conversations, and the way he would answer questions and the way he had the pulse of the entire organization and what he wanted to do and what they wanted to be, and everybody just kind of fit in around him, because they followed the leadership. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm looking for. Dan Campbell, I think, is a great example too, that, we had all these questions when he first got there and who he was going to be and biting kneecaps and all this stuff. But this team, from day one, he said, this is what we're going to be. And he's been able to follow through on those exact things. And we can take it all the way to last night. Why did they win that game last night? Because they were physically dominating over the Minnesota Vikings. They dominated in every area, mentally and physically were better than the Vikings last night. And that's what Dan Campbell said in his very first press conference. This is what we will be, and this is how we will succeed. And we saw that come to fruition, again last night. And that's the kind of stuff, to me, those are the kind of leaders and head coaches that I want if I'm in an organization.
Kurt, as always, man, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for everything that you did for this show throughout this season.
You got it, guys. I enjoyed the real deep football conversations that we were able to have. So I appreciate that part of it. I appreciate not having fluff, but being able to really dive into things. And I know we'll touch base here in the near future. And best of luck with your organization moving forward.
Thanks,
yes,
man.
Thank you very much.
We'll call you after they hire. We'll call you after they hire John Gruden. Thanks, buddy.